I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. We often take our lungs for granted. It's one of those fascinating things about the brain's ability to put our body's functions on a kind of autopilot. While we go about our day, these marvelous organs do their job, expanding and contracting to pull in life-sustaining oxygen. Yet beneath this simple rhythm lies an intricate biological system. Today's guest, Dr. Button, is a leading researcher in pulmonary physiology. His work explores how the lungs function at both the cellular and systemic levels, with a particular emphasis on how environmental conditions can profoundly influence respiratory health. As evidence grows, linking environmental factors to chronic conditions like asthma and COPD, Dr. Button's research is shedding new light on how subtle shifts in our surroundings might trigger or exacerbate disease. Dr. Button, welcome. Can you start by introducing yourself?
My name is Brian Button. I'm a professor in the Department of Biophysics and Biochemistry at the University of North Carolina. I'm also a member of the Marsico Lung Institute, where we study a variety of different lung diseases. I am curious about how our research can draw parallels from plant transpiration to airway biology and airway dynamics to understand how breathing environments that are very dehumidified can affect our physiology and what can be done by clinicians to apply our research to treating people with lung disease or people that are exposed to these environments, and what climatologists can do to understand what atmospheric drivers do to creating these environments.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your work and about what you do?
So, my research really revolves around understanding muco-obstructive lung diseases. And so these are a class of diseases that are, as the name suggests, these are revolving around mucus production. So this can be a variety of things from genetics, such as cystic fibrosis, could be a mix of genetics and environmental, such as asthma, chronic bronchitis, COPD, and a variety of other diseases that probably most people don't hear of before from another a range of different genetic and environmental factors. And so my research really revolves around understanding, how does our lungs stay clean of all the stuff that we're inhaling normally, and what happens in disease states.
So, can you explain more about your recent research study in Nature about climate change and how this affects the health of our lungs?
We were interested in understanding of what happens when you breathe dry air. So, under normal circumstances, our airways can keep up with evaporative water loss. When you exhale, you're exhaling water from that's derived from the airway surface. And so, what we found is that under small changes in humidity, you have no problem doing that. However, the capacity to secrete water is lost when you have very dehumidified air, is that you can reach a point to where now you're evaporating the water off of the cell surface. And this is making a mucus that's going to be more like what you have in disease. It's going to be harder to clear. So bacteria can grow. And so this could lead to potential problems in your respiratory health because of that.
Is there an increase in the amount of dry air that people are breathing consistently?
The interesting part is that when you go into a room, especially in the wintertime, what you have is the system takes in cold air that is maybe humidified, but once it brings it up to a hotter temperature, you're now at this deficit of how much water. And so that air wants to take in more water. And so just going into different environments, different rooms with different, heating systems, even inside, can cause problems with dehumidification of your airways.
So you were also, though, looking at how climate change then therefore affects the type of air that we're breathing. Is that, though, because it's becoming warmer and people are using more air conditioning and heating systems and that's why it dries the air, or is it also outside?
It's both. So as we're in environments, even outside, that are acutely changing the humidity. So if you go outside and it's very dry, we all notice that we're all of a sudden our throat's a little bit tighter. We're drinking water, but also I do that same thing inside. The building that I'm in has very poor humidity control. So I go inside and all of a sudden I'm drinking a lot more water and just to hydrate the throat, but your airways are still getting very dry air. So, you get a little chest tightening and it's seemingly hard to breathe. In you and I, it's not a problem. I mean, we can probably, do this, all day long, not a problem. But in people that already have a little bit of established lung disease, so an asthmatic might be an example, this might be taking them a little bit over the edge. And so this might exacerbate or make that problem a little bit worse by going into environments that are dry.
Can also this repeatedly drying environment and in the lungs create diseases?
That's a good question. I think we just don't know enough of that. Is that really the what establishes? So if you're chronically breathing air of different humidity, if you don't live in an environment that's dry, whether it does or not is still a remaining question. I think there still needs to be research to do this. So in full disclosure, our experiments were on the scale of relatively transient, so 24 hours, and this is in our cell culture work, but also our animal work, where we did see an effect. But what we don't know is long term. You know, do they develop a disease? Do they adapt to it? Maybe these people that are living in very arid and dry environments, maybe they can adapt to that environment. We just don't know at this point.
So I find it fascinating, and I didn't really know or realize that how much work the lungs are doing to protect us and to protect us against bacteria or particles. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so the mucus layer is really interesting in that, it's a layer that is normally produced. We produce about 500 milliliters, half a liter a day, and it's constantly being secreted out. And it's really fascinating because it's a very sticky material. Everyone that's coughed up mucus when they get cold knows this. It's very sticky. And so it has properties that are really excellent for binding bacteria, viruses, and everything bad that you breathe in every day and keeps us nice and healthy.
Personally, it seems like there's much more mucus in the morning when people wake up. Is that true?
That's a good observation. And so this is the problem is that when you're sleeping, laying down, you're not breathing as deep. You also, when I'm huffing right there or when you're coughing, you'll also clear mucus. And there is cyclical changes that happen when you do sleep. And so that's a very common observation. And certainly the folks that have lung disease notice that very well is that they're feeling the worst right in the morning.
Do humidifiers and things like that, are they helpful to create a less drying environment?
I think that's an important thing is that, in nowadays, especially in older buildings that do not have active humidification systems, maybe in your office or in your house, humidification systems are great, but there is a little bit of a caveat that everyone should be aware of. And I think this is, one of the things that we learned is that, you want wetter air, you want more humid air to breathe in, but also at the same time, you need to make sure that if you do have humidifiers, you need to keep them nice and clean because over time, what you'll get is you might get some fungal infection into that or bacteria into the water or the filters. So if you do have a humidifier, which I definitely recommend, you want to make sure it's clean.
It's kind of funny because maybe you want to open up the windows and have more humidity in your house and be less based on the air conditioning, but at the same time, if it's allergy season, that's another difficult, environment, right? So what's better or worse?
It's a good question. I mean, there's really nice HEPA filtration systems that you can get. Um, you know, Most people don't want to fill their house, each room with devices. There are, systems that you can have for air conditioning systems that can both filter and increase humidity. I guess it's whichever you're more sensitive to. Certainly, allergy season, thank God, doesn't last very long, but certainly, during that time, yeah, you may want to just close the windows and add a humidifier.
I also noticed that in the news release, it was mentioned mouth breathing. How is that related to the whole process?
Yeah, a very good question. So, when you breathe, most people, if you're just casually breathing, well, most people are nose breathers. And so the nose itself has a very, very large surface area, has a lot of canals and everything that the air goes through. And so in that process, the whole point of that is to humidify the air. So by the time it's back at the back of your larynx, it is mostly it's like 95% humidity, so your airways are only dealing with a very small change in humidity. And so everything is fine. However, people that have issues with sinusitis, obesity is another thing where people are breathing by mouth. They don't get the benefit of the humidification through the nose. And so the air there is a lot drier that's reaching. So this is certainly a problem in and of itself, whether you do have a large change in humidity.
Yeah, it's so funny because I have personally and this automatic reaction that it's almost now even subconscious that if I'm in a place that maybe is higher bacteria because it smells bad, I won't breathe through my nose. I'll breathe through my mouth in order not to smell it.
Yeah, you're right, it's a natural thing to, because your nose, that's where you sense smell. But certainly, I guess, one of the other therapies is what, and this is the collaborators. This was a very collaborative project. This is really a team science paper with, clinicians, mathematicians, and so this is what's really interesting about this project is it involves so many people in different disciplines, but one of them is working on ways to where we can have like you've seen asthmatics, they have inhalers to deliver bronchodilators. But if you had something that could, if you're in an environment and you're feeling very irritated, to breathe in special formulations that really could lubricate, may not be the exact right word, but it's something to keep your airways hydrated when you're feeling irritated, and that might be very important for people that have lung disease that are really worried about having complications due to breathing in dry.
What about saunas?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. I'm a big fan of saunas, hot tubs, anywhere where you get extra humidity. So if you have access to it, they're very cathartic. So I love those. But everyone doesn't have access to those, and have to, you'd have to go somewhere to do it. But certainly, you anywhere involved. In fact, it's a little of an interesting story. Is that for people with cystic fibrosis, a vast majority of them inhale hypertonic saline. So this is salt water basically. And the reason it got found out is that there was a group of CF patients in Australia that these were surfers, and they found that they had much more milder disease, that their disease progression was less. And so the researchers there said, what's the real connection? They found out that they were surfers breathing in the salty, high humidity air at the beach. And so people now take inhale salt water. And so if you're really sensitive to dry air or dehumidification, it's something that these patients can do, and it's literally just it's prescription based salt water.
Your studies were done in isolated cell cultures. How does this translate to humans?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we certainly learn a lot using cell culture models and the limited animal experiments that we did in this paper. But I think really to understand what our data translates into humans is that we need to do clinical studies. We need to do studies where we take people, have them breathe in dry environments, monitor them, take samples from them to find out, is there a way for them to adapt to these issues, whether there is things that can be done. And so this is where I think the next steps are, is to take this into clinical studies and to understand, is it as bad as we think it is?
So tell me more about how many people maybe are affected by asthma and are affected by issues related to your research.
So roughly 1 in 12 people in the United States, roughly 28 million people are affected by asthma, and it's also very prevalent in children. So certainly there's aspects of our research that's very important to a large percentage of the population. And this doesn't include people with more infrequent diseases such as cystic fibrosis and other manifestations of mucobstructive lung diseases. So I think what we learn can certainly translate into improving the lives of people with these disorders.
So, how did you get into this field of research?
So, I got my PhD in ion transport. I was a person that studied the ion channel that's defective in cystic fibrosis. So, I'm an electrophysiologist, biophysicist by training. And when I came to UNC, they had a professor there who is a mucus biologist. So, which most people think, gosh, there's people that actually study mucus. That's gross. But what was really fascinating is that but from its biochemical properties, it's a very interesting molecule. These things are, it's dominated by a protein called mucin, which is it's like a polymer, a glycopolymer that loves water and it's very, very sticky and has some really fascinating properties that I could spend another hour telling you all about. But nevertheless, what is there's so many unknown things about it is that how it keeps us healthy and what role it plays in lung diseases. So, as I mentioned, mucus becomes concentrated. And as I said earlier, mucus is normally 98% water, but it only has to change to say 94% water. So, it's still mostly water. But this is a mucus that cannot be transported or very difficult to be transported. So, our bodies spend an inordinate amount of energy and work to keep that mucus hydrated. And so it's really fast. It's been really fascinating career to understand why it changes in disease and what we can do therapeutically to improve by either decreasing these proteins that get too accumulated into lung diseases or keep them better hydrated.
I mean, I agree. It is very interesting. And are there people that have more or less mucus production?
People with chronic bronchitis, COPD, they have, and also in asthma for a different reason, is that they produce more of these mucins. And so what happens is that in the case of, I'll give you an example, is people with asthma, when they have a asthma attack, and what happens is that they release a lot more mucus. And unfortunately, our airways cannot keep that mucus hydrated. And so what happens is that it fills the airspace. And if they cannot get, emergency help and hospitalized on bronchodilators and things to help with the mucus, is that unfortunately these people die because of that acutely.
So, not in those maybe acute situations or those emergency situations, but in general, for people that they do have issues with asthma, for example, would you recommend that it's really important for them to drink a lot of water in addition to maybe the humidity that they're exposing themselves to?
It's a good question. I think certainly drinking water certainly helps the back of the throat, nose, getting them to nose breathe. That certainly helps. I think that that's not enough. When you drink water, you're humidifying the larynx, which is great, but only very transiently. It's good to stay hydrated. My doctor always says, drink more water, Brian. But certainly, taking therapies which can keep your airway hydrated, like hypertonic saline. There's other things out there. Staying in environments that are more humidified, and humidifying your room, especially at nighttime, I think is probably good practice. I think that most pulmonologists recommend that to their patients.
What are you working on now, or what are you working on next after this?
Yeah, so we're in this vein. What we're doing is we're trying to find out what happens. So, as a little bit of a kind of buried in this paper, we found that uh, when airway cells were exposed to dehumidified environments, is that we saw gene expression change. We saw cytokines that were being produced, and so these are pro-inflammatory. Your body's responding to that, and this is a natural process to sort of say, hey, something's happening. We need to make sure that we're either ramping up, decreasing water because of an environment. So this could be bad, is to get chronic changes in these cytokines. But we're also now looking at other gene expressions. What are the things that our cells are doing to respond for this? Some of these things can be good, at least transiently, but long term, these might be very, very bad for people that are breathing in long term environments. Conversely, we're trying to ask is that, what happens long term? So if you go and all of a sudden move from, Canada down to Phoenix, Arizona, where it's really dry, does your body adapt to that environment? Can they overcome that to get more accustomed to breathing in dry air? So there's a lot of interesting work that I think that this work really establishes, because now that we have a team of, as I mentioned, clinicians, scientists, mathematicians, other biologists that are, know these areas, we're sort of putting together a good understanding of what's going on, and importantly, what should we be doing to mitigate these issues.
What do you find most fascinating in your work daily, or what was maybe something that was recently really fascinating for you?
From a mucus biology point of view, it's always really interesting to me to that we know so little about it. Despite that it's 2025, we know all the players involved, but we know very little about its regulation. And I think the real future becomes, at least in understanding for you and I, if you don't have lung disease, is how this mucus layer is evolved. How is it cleared? What happens? Because I'll give you a good example, is that mucus, as you're sitting right now standing up, your mucus has to transport against gravity. So how does your body position, and your airways are in all orientations, how does body position affect mucus clearance? When you're laying down, is it better for your trachea, but it may be worse for other parts of your lungs that are normally not in that orientation? So there's a lot of biochemistry, biophysics, cell biology work that really has to be done to really fully understand this. And once we have a better understanding of what happens normally, we can really tease out what's going on disease, why are people so sensitive to changes in their environment.
Thank you, Dr. Brian Button. I really appreciate our conversation today.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.